everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then definitely subscribe. It's my current goal to try and get to 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. As I'm filming this, we're on around 42,000, so we've got quite a way to go, but it would help massively if you could give this video a like and also share my channel with anyone you know that enjoys this kind of content. Also, just double check that you are subscribed, because according to my analytics page, around 45% of my viewers aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Anyway, as you can see from the length of this video, today we are covering a big case. Today we are talking about Fred and Rose West, a serial killer couple from England who murdered at least 12 women, 2 of which were their own daughters. This is a case that I have wanted to cover for the longest time, but I've always found it a bit daunting because there is so much information about this case out there and I want to do the case justice. This one is very dark and upsetting. It's one of the worst cases I've ever researched, so that's just a pre-warning. But anyway, I'm going to stop rambling now and let's just get into the story of Fred and Rose West, starting with Fred's childhood. So this case took place in the county of Gloucestershire in the southwest of England. But Fred's story begins in Much Marcle, which is a village in the Herefordshire countryside. Fred West was born Frederick Walter Stephen West on the 29th of September 1941 to his father Walter West and his mother Daisy Hill. Fred was Walter's and Daisy's second child. However, their first baby was a little girl named Violet. She was born prematurely and a few days after she was born she passed away in her cradle. The couple had 8 children in total, but sadly 2 of them passed away when they were infants, one of which was Violet and the other was a little boy named David. So 6 of their children survived, and these were obviously Fred, the oldest boy, John, Daisy, Douglas, Kathleen, who was also known as Kitty, and Gwen. By 1951, when Daisy gave birth to their last child, Gwen, the West family were living in Moorcourt Cottage, which was next to a farm known as Moorcourt Farm, and Walter West worked there at the farm. He was a milking herdsman and he also helped with the harvest. The cottage was semi-detached with 3 bedrooms, so with 6 children it was pretty cramped. The 3 boys all had to share a room and so did 3 girls. And they lived in pretty poor conditions. The house was always dirty. They had a really bad rat problem. They would get a lot of rats on the property and Fred would constantly witness his mother shooting the rats with her husband's shotgun. The West children were subjected to bad abuse. They would be beaten a lot by both parents. Both their mother and father were abusive. And just as a side note, there was actually speculation that Walter West himself was a killer, just like his son Fred would eventually turn out to be. You see, before marrying Daisy, Walter had another wife who I think was about 20 years older than him, and one day she just suddenly died. Walter told people that her cause of death was from a bee sting. However, it's been theorized that he murdered her. For what reason, I don't know. Though that can't be confirmed, we don't know for certain that's what happened, but a lot of people believe that it is. Walter West was a very violent man and a sexual predator. Fred would often witness his father forcing himself on young women and even children in the fields around the farm. He saw them as objects that he could do whatever he liked with, and not just people either. According to sources, he would also engage in bestiality with the animals on the farm, and he was very open about all of this, particularly with his eldest son Fred. In fact, he would teach Fred how to engage in bestiality himself. Walter wasn't ashamed of anything he ever did, and so naturally growing up, Fred thought all of this was just normal behaviour. He grew up with the same mentality as his father. Fred was always his mother's favourite child. Without a doubt, he was her favourite. He could do no wrong in his mother's eyes. She was always so protective of Fred, probably because he was her second child. Obviously her first child, Violet, passed away, and so when Fred came along, she was extra protective of him. She pretty much worshipped him. Like I said before, she could be very abusive. Daisy could be very violent towards her children, but out of all of them, Fred was probably the one who received the least beatings from his mother because he was such a mummy's boy. And Daisy would get so angry at anyone who criticised her son or tried to punish him. Obviously back in those days, kids would regularly get hit by teachers at school for misbehaving, and whenever Fred would get hit by a teacher, he would go home crying to his mother, and his mother would turn up at school the next day and literally just scream and shout at this teacher. And Fred's classmates loved it. It was so entertaining for them watching Daisy West having a go at this teacher, but at the same time the other kids also bullied Fred for this, the fact that his mummy would come into school and defend him. On the outside, it probably looked like the two, Daisy and Fred, just had a very close mother-son bond. But in actual fact, Daisy began sexually abusing her son from a very young age. She would often get into bed with her son and seduce him, and it's believed that Fred lost his virginity to his own mother. By age 15, Fred had left school and he didn't bother taking any of his exams. He was not an intelligent guy in the slightest. Sources say that when he left school, he had the reading and writing ability of a 7-year-old. He went straight into working on the farm with his father, doing a mixture of jobs. He really wasn't paid very much at all, but I don't think that really bothered him. He probably enjoyed working on the farm as a labourer much more than going to school. In general, Fred didn't really care too much about his appearance. He wouldn't wash very much. He wouldn't really brush his teeth were really yellow. However, sometimes he would make a bit of an effort for the girls in the local youth club. Despite his poor personal hygiene, a lot of young girls actually found Fred attractive. However, Fred, being raised in the way he was by his father, he did not respect women. If he fancied a girl at the youth club, he would just grab her, even if she showed no interest in him whatsoever. When Fred was 17 years old in 1958, he saved up some money to buy his first motorcycle, which was a 125cc James bike. The picture on screen now shows him on his new motorbike with his siblings around him. He absolutely loved his new vehicle. It gave him some freedom. However, on the 28th of November 1958, he actually crashed this motorbike and collided with a girl named Pat, who was cycling in the opposite direction. It's not known exactly what happened or whose fault the accident was, although some people believe Fred collided with Pat's bike on purpose. But I'm not sure I believe that, because he loved this vehicle. I don't think he would have wanted to do any damage to it. And also, he was very badly injured from this incident. Pat herself didn't really sustain any serious injuries. She had a couple of bruises and cuts, but other than that, she was completely fine. I don't think she really needed any medical attention. Whereas Fred was actually knocked unconscious from the crash, and he had lost quite a lot of blood, and for a whole week he didn't wake up. He was in a coma, but when he eventually did wake up, he said that it felt like he was, quote, coming back from the dead. A steel plate was fitted into his head. His nose was broken, which meant that it was crooked for the rest of his life, and he had to have a metal brace on one of his legs while the bone mended. But then just 2 years later, in 1960, he injured his head again when he was at youth club. Basically, one night he was at youth club and he tried to grab a girl. Some sources say he put his hand up her skirt while she was stood on the fire escape steps. And in response, this girl turns around and just hits him, which causes him to lose his balance, and he falls off the fire escape steps and lands head first on the concrete floor. Once again, this head injury knocked him unconscious and he was rushed straight to the hospital in Hereford, where he came around about a day later. But this time, something was different. This head injury seemed to change something in Fred. He was never really the same after this. I mean, he was a disgusting person before this, but now he was just very temperamental. He had a temper, he was irritable, and he had a lot of violent mood swings. And I believe it was around this same time that he started committing petty theft with a couple of his friends. They would steal cigarette cases, and Fred stole like a gold watch strap. And this resulted in his first brush with the law. He went to Ledbury Magistrates Court charged with theft, and he was fined £4 for the crime, which was obviously worth a lot more back then. And then not long after this, in June of 1961, when Fred was around 19-20 years old, he found himself involved with the police again when it was discovered that he had raped his 13-year-old sister Kitty and gotten her pregnant. So he was arrested and questioned about this, and Fred was, to be honest, really confused and annoyed that he was even being interviewed. He admitted to the police that he would often molest younger girls. He had done for years, and he just didn't understand what all the fuss was about, because to him, this was completely normal behaviour. He had witnessed his father, Walter, doing the same things throughout his entire childhood. So Fred was just like, well, doesn't everyone do it? Kitty had an abortion, and Fred's mother, Daisy, was apparently so disgusted with what her son had done, and she didn't really want anything to do with him after this, which is rich coming from her, considering she sexually abused Fred when he was a child. But anyway, he was charged with sexually abusing the poor girl and he went to trial. However, it all just collapsed. The trial collapsed because Kitty didn't want to face Fred in court. She didn't want to give evidence against him, and so he was just released. After this whole thing, Daisy sent her son away to live with his aunt and uncle for a year, but in the summer of 1962, he returned to Moorcourt Cottage in Much Marcle, and he began living with his parents again and continued working as a building labourer. And it was around this same time that an old flame, a previous girlfriend of Fred's, came back into his life. Her name was Catherine Castello, but she preferred to be called Rena. So for this video, I'll be calling her Rena. And she was 16 years old when she met a 19-year-old Fred West at a dance in the local hall in 1960. She was from Scotland, and like Fred, she also had a history of theft. And in the summer of 1960, she travelled to England to visit some family members. As I said, she met Fred at a local dance, and the two quickly began dating and sleeping together, but she was only in England for a few months before returning home to Scotland, where she started earning money through sex work. And then fast forward a couple of years later, in 1962, Rena returned to England and began seeing Fred again, and she soon told him that she was actually pregnant with another man's child. When she was back in Scotland, she slept with an Asian bus driver and he had gotten her pregnant. However, the two, Fred and Rena, decided to get married and pretend to everyone else that Fred was actually the father of this baby. Shortly after they married, Fred and Rena decided to move into a flat in the town of Coatbridge in Scotland, and right from the beginning of this marriage, Fred did not treat his wife well at all. He would demand sex from her constantly. If he wanted sex, he was going to get it, even if it meant raping her. And if she put up a fight and said no, he would just beat her. But as well as that, I think he also just expected her to be a typical housewife. He expected her to clean the place every single day and cook him dinner every night. And if dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it, he would get violent. And this was all whilst Rena was pregnant. He didn't care. He would just beat her even though she was pregnant. Rena gave birth to a little girl on the 22nd of March 1963, and she named her Charmaine. However, Rena and Fred quickly realised that people were not going to believe that Charmaine was Fred's child, because Charmaine was obviously mixed race. She had darker skin from her biological father, who was Asian. So they came up with a cover story and they told everyone that Rena had sadly miscarried their baby, and so instead they decided to adopt a mixed race child, and that was Charmaine. And it seems as though pretty much as soon as Charmaine was born, Fred immediately decided that he didn't like her. Just over a year after the birth of Charmaine, Rena gave birth to her second baby, which was biologically Fred's. It was another little girl and they named her Anna Marie. And Fred treated her very differently to how he treated Charmaine. He was really not very nice to Charmaine, and it's believed that this was probably because she wasn't his biological daughter, so he treated her really badly. Around this time, Fred was actually working as an ice cream van driver, and once when Charmaine asked if she could have an ice cream, he literally slapped her round the face. But he was so different with Anna Marie. He was so fond of her and affectionate with her, but he was horrible to Charmaine. Fred cheated on his wife Rena many times with numerous women. He actually used to boast that he had gotten so many women in Scotland pregnant. However, when he found out that Rena was cheating on him with a man named John, he went insane. He caught John and Rena kissing one night and he went crazy at Rena and he beat her so badly. So basically he was allowed to cheat on her with multiple women, but she wasn't allowed to do the same. When she did cheat on him, she was beaten. Anyway, by this point the family were living in Glasgow in Scotland, and they had a lodger, I guess, staying with them, a woman named Isa McNeil. Rena and Fred had agreed to let Isa stay with them if she looked after Charmaine and Anna Marie when they were both out of the house. And Isa quickly noticed how bad Fred would treat his family. She noticed that Fred would effectively keep his two children, Charmaine and Anna Marie, in cages a lot of the time. I say cages, they weren't actual cages. Basically they had bunk beds, and he would make both Anna Marie and Charmaine sleep in the bottom bit of the bunk bed, and he put wooden slats around it so that they couldn't get out. They were kept in this cage a lot, particularly Charmaine, because he didn't like her. She was kept in there sometimes for hours and hours and hours. It must have been so horrific. Anyway, Isa McNeil was working for the West as their nanny, and eventually she introduced Fred and Rena to a friend of hers, 16-year-old Anna McFall. And Anna really liked the West family, particularly Fred. At the time she was grieving the loss of her boyfriend Duncan. He had died following an accident at his work, and she was of course heartbroken by this. So I think spending time with the West family was a really good distraction for her. It was November of 1965 and the family had been living in Scotland for a couple of years, but that was all about to change, because one day when Fred was driving around Glasgow in his ice cream van, he actually ran over a 4-year-old boy, and this boy sadly passed away. Fred was arrested and questioned by the police, but it soon became clear that he genuinely didn't mean to run him over. It was a genuine accident, and so he was released without charges. But local people really didn't like Fred West from this point onwards, because even though it was accidental, he had killed a 4-year-old. And so people just stopped giving him any business. He wasn't making any money anymore from his ice cream van. And so as a result, Fred decided to pack up his family and move to Gloucester in England. They lived in a caravan in a caravan park, and not only did Fred, Rena and their 2 children move down there, but so did Isa McNeil and Anna McFall. They all lived in this one caravan, making the caravan very cramped. Fred got a job in a slaughterhouse. Isa McNeil continued her job as their nanny, and I don't believe Rena and Anna McFall worked very much. I think sometimes they did babysitting jobs for the neighbours, but other than that they were just home all the time. But eventually Rena and Isa McNeil moved back to Scotland because they were just sick of Fred's treatment of them, particularly Rena. He was still very abusive and violent towards her. She just couldn't take it anymore, so they moved back to Scotland, and Rena really wanted to take her children, Anna Marie and Charmaine, with her. But of course, Fred, being the controlling man he was, he would not let her. But she travelled back to Gloucester as often as she could to visit her 2 daughters, and she did keep trying to get full custody of them. So as you can tell, the only woman out of the 3 to stay with Fred in Gloucester was Anna McFall, and they very quickly started their own relationship. She was absolutely head over heels in love with Fred West, and when Rena and Isa left, she became Charmaine and Anna Marie's new nanny. And Anna tried her absolute hardest to look after the girls when Fred was at work, but you've got to remember she was only a teenager. She was only around 16 years old, so it was really difficult for her. And so Fred actually decided to put both Charmaine and Anne-Marie into care homes, and they would be in and out of the care system over the next few years. The 2 girls really did not have a stable childhood, a stable life. It was like when Fred could be bothered to look after them, he would have them with him, but when he couldn't, he would just put them back into the care system. At the beginning of 1967, Anna McFall actually became pregnant with Fred's child, and from what I can gather, she was excited about this pregnancy. She wanted to have Fred's baby, and she tried to convince him to divorce Rena, because at this point they hadn't actually divorced yet, and Rena was living either in or near Gloucestershire in her own caravan because she was still trying to get her kids back. And Anna tried to convince Fred to divorce Rena and marry her instead. But Fred saw this as a problem. He saw this pregnancy as a problem. He did not want Anna to have this child. In fact, he did not want anything more to do with Anna at all. And so he decided to murder her, to get rid of her. It's believed she was murdered sometime in July of 1967, as that was when she was last seen, and she would have been heavily pregnant by this point. Initially, years and years later, in police interviews, Fred denied having ever killed Anna McFall, but in June of 1994, 27 years after she disappeared, her dismembered remains were discovered buried in a field on the outskirts of Much Markle, and the skeleton of her unborn baby was next to her. It's believed Fred cut the baby out of her womb. Wrapped around Anna's wrist was a dressing gown cord, so he had clearly tried to restrain her, and her fingers and toes had also been cut off. And this was something that Fred would go on to do with the rest of his murders. He would cut off his victims' fingers and toes and dispose of them elsewhere, because without them they couldn't be fingerprinted, and without fingerprints it would make it a lot more difficult to identify the bodies. And although Fred initially denied Anna's murder to the police, sources say he did admit to someone that visited him in prison years later that he stabbed Anna to death after they had an argument. Anna McFall's body was the last of Fred's victims to be found in the 1990s, but she is his first confirmed victim. So she was his first murder, but she was the last to be found. After Anna's murder, Fred moved to a new caravan site in Bishop's Cleeve in Gloucestershire, and he and Rena actually got back together. I'm not sure if she ever questioned what happened to Anna McFall, but if she did, I'm sure Fred would have come up with some excuse as to where she was. But they got back together and lived in the caravan with the two children, Charmaine and Anna Marie, and it's believed that Fred started sexually abusing his stepdaughter Charmaine around this time. His and Rena's relationship seemed to be fine for a while, but just a year after they reunited, she decided to leave him again, and once again the children were left in his care. It's believed that Fred may have committed a second murder in January of 1968. 15-year-old Mary Bastholm was last seen waiting at a bus stop on Bristol Road in Gloucester, and you'll notice later that is where he picked up a lot of his victims, from bus stops. Mary and Fred knew each other because she used to work in a cafe that Fred would often pop into, and according to a book I read about this case, he did actually admit to a family member that he killed Mary, and he would boast about it as if it was something to be proud of, because to him it was. But he never admitted it to the police, and there was never any solid evidence that he did kill her, and I believe her body has never been found. So he might have killed her, or he might not have. We don't know. That case is not confirmed. And then later that same year, in November of 1968, 27-year-old Fred West met the woman that would go on to become his accomplice in the sexual assaults and murders of numerous women. Her name was Rosemary Letts. Fred was working as a delivery driver for a bakery at the time, and he met 15-year-old Rose, yes, 15, she was 12 years younger than him. He met her at a bus stop in Cheltenham. Fred began chatting to Rose and flirting with her, and he would do this pretty much every day during work with many girls. He loved his job as a delivery driver for that reason. It meant he could drive around and chat up local girls. But there was something different about Rose Letts. He was very interested in her, more so than any girl he had ever encountered. But before we talk any more about what happens next with these two, let me just tell you about Rose's childhood, which was actually pretty similar to Fred's in some aspects. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on the 29th of November 1953 in the county of Devon in the southwest of England. Her father was named William Letts, or Bill as he preferred to be called, and her mother was named Daisy Fuller. Daisy and Bill had 7 children. They had 4 girls and 3 boys, and Rose was their 5th child. The family were pretty poor. They never had very much money, and both Rose's parents had mental health issues. Her father Bill was a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was a very controlling and violent man. He was very abusive towards his wife Daisy. He expected her to be a typical housewife. He wanted her to cook all the meals and keep the house spotless, and if she didn't, he would get violent. People in the village would constantly see Daisy with black eyes where Bill had beaten her, and all of this abuse resulted in Daisy suffering with very severe depression. And by the time she was pregnant with Rose, her 5th child, she was actually referred to a psychiatric hospital where a psychiatrist suggested she have electroconvulsive therapy, so electric shock therapy, to try and help her depression, and she agreed. I think she was willing to try anything. She received a couple of ECT treatments during her pregnancy. She would be strapped down and given a muscle relaxing drug, and then electrodes were attached to her scalp, which when switched on would pass electricity through her brain. So whilst Rose was growing and developing in the womb, her mother was receiving electric shock therapy, and a lot of people believe that this affected Rose's brain. Apparently Daisy's last treatment was just a few days before Rose was born, and it was clear pretty much right from when Rose was a baby that she was different to her siblings. When she was in her pram, she would rock so violently that the pram would move, and this is something that she would continue to do throughout the rest of her childhood. She would rock her head for literally hours and hours, just back and forth, back and forth. She wasn't a very intelligent child. People described her as being slow, and her siblings would call her Dozy Rosie. Her oldest brother Andrew described Rose as being, quote, as thick as two planks. Because of this, because she wasn't very intelligent and the fact that she was a little bit overweight, she was pretty badly bullied in school. But to be fair, she could hold her own. She used to get really upset by the bullying and she would go home from school in tears, but as she got older, she would react to the bullying with violence. She would attack her bullies. As well as being abusive towards his wife, Bill Letts was also very abusive towards his children. I've got another quote here from Andrew, Rose's brother, about the abuse that they suffered at the hands of their father, and he said, quote, when he used to get angry, he went out of control. He would pick up a knife to you, an axe. He would beat us children up and not care how far he went. Although in all honesty, Rose was probably beaten the least by her father out of all of the children. She seemed to be his favourite. It seemed like Rose knew how to get in her father's good books. But Rose was sexually abused by her father from a very young age. I believe he probably sexually abused his other daughters as well, Rose's older sisters, but they left home as soon as they could to get away from him. Just like Fred had lost his virginity to his mother, it seems Rose had probably lost hers to her father Bill. As Rose entered her teenage years around the age of 12 to 13, she seemed to have developed a fascination with sex, and she would walk around the house completely naked in front of her brothers. She wanted them to see her naked. And as her father continued to sexually abuse her, Rose actually began sexually abusing her younger brother, Graham. She would climb into her little brother's bed at night when he was around like 9 or 10, and she would sexually assault him. And obviously Graham, being the age he was, he didn't understand sex, and he thought that his sister was just being really affectionate towards him. He thought that she was being a loving sister. He wanted affection and love because he didn't receive it at all from his parents, and Rose continued abusing Graham for years until she eventually left home. As a teenager, Rose was never really interested in boys her own age. She was much more interested in older men, and when her parents weren't home, she would walk around the village and just chat and flirt with older guys, adult men. Also at the age of 13, the Letts family packed up and moved from Devon to Bishop's Cleeve in Gloucestershire, but Rose only lived there for about 2 years when her mother Daisy decided to leave her abusive husband Bill, and she moved to Cheltenham with Rose and her 2 younger brothers. I believe Daisy and Bill did eventually get back together, but Rose soon decided that she wanted to live with her father. So she moved back in with him in Bishop's Cleeve, but she worked as a waitress in a tea shop in Cheltenham. So she caught the bus there often for her job and to see her mother. And as I said earlier, this was where she met 27-year-old Fred West. She met him at a bus stop in Cheltenham. According to one source, when Rose first met Fred, she actually thought he was homeless because of his appearance. Like I mentioned earlier, Fred had very poor personal hygiene. He would very rarely wash or brush his teeth, and so I don't think Rose was really interested in him at first. But Fred was a very charming man. He was a massive flirt, and Rose quickly fell for him. They began going on a couple of dates together, and Fred started giving her some pretty expensive gifts, which is believed he had just stolen. But Rose loved it. She loved the attention this older man was giving her. Eventually, Fred introduced Rose to his daughter Anna Marie and stepdaughter Charmaine, and within literally a few weeks, Rose had left her job and agreed to become the girl's new nanny. So by this point, Fred and Rose are in a relationship, and Fred was so happy to have found a girl like Rose because he really enjoyed very violent, sadistic sex, and he never really had a partner before who was willing to do this with him. He always had to force it. Rena was not really into that at all. She refused to take part in his sex games, and so he would just rape her. But Rose didn't refuse. She was pretty open to all of it. Rose soon introduced her new boyfriend, her first proper boyfriend, Fred, to her parents, Bill and Daisy, and they both disapproved of Fred instantly, particularly Rose's father, Bill. He could not stand Fred. He would threaten Fred, and he even contacted the police and social services because Rose was underage. Obviously, she was only 15 years old, and he felt that Fred, this 27-year-old adult man, was taking advantage of his daughter, which, I mean, he was. Not that Bill was any better. He had been sexually abusing his daughter for years by this point. I just find it so crazy. It's a similar situation to Fred and his mother. Obviously, Fred got his 13-year-old sister Kitty pregnant, and his mother pretty much disowned him at the time for it. She hated him for what he did, and I agree, it's disgusting. But I just find it, like, what leg does she have to stand on to criticize him for that when she sexually abused him when he was a child? And it's the same situation with Bill. He hated Fred, and he felt like he was taking advantage of his 15-year-old daughter. But Bill had been sexually assaulting Rose for years. I don't know, maybe it was jealousy. Maybe he was just really jealous of Fred because he wanted Rose. So Bill sent his daughter to a home for troubled teenagers in Cheltenham in an attempt to keep her away from Fred. But it didn't work at all because she would just visit him on weekends when she was allowed out of the home. Her time at the home came to an end when she was 16 years old, and following this she moved in with Fred, and by the time she was 17 the couple had moved into a flat in Gloucester, 25 Midland Road. Here they lived with Charmaine and Anna Marie, and another child was on the way. Rose was pregnant with their first child, and on the 17th of October 1970, she gave birth to a baby girl, and they called her Heather. But then just 2 months after Heather was born, Fred was actually sent to prison because he stole from his place of work. At the time, he was working as a vehicle fitter at Cotswold Tyres, and he stole 5 tyres from there, probably to sell on. Anyway, they found out and reported him to the police, and he was charged with theft, and he was sent to prison, meaning that Rose was left to look after Charmaine, Anna Marie, and newborn baby Heather, which she found really difficult. She went from having no children and having virtually no responsibilities to suddenly having to look after 3 children all on her own. She treated Charmaine and Anna Marie really badly. She would beat them if they misbehaved and shout at them constantly. It was just a really horrible environment for the girls, but I mean, by this point they were used to it. They were already treated really badly by Fred, especially Charmaine, and Anna Marie always said that Charmaine, despite only being like 8 years old, she was so headstrong and brave. No matter how many times she was shouted at or beaten, she would never cry, and it seems that Rose hated that. She hated that she couldn't break Charmaine, so in turn she just beat her even more. Charmaine would just constantly say to Rose, our real mummy wouldn't treat us like this, my real mummy wouldn't do this, and this angered Rose so much. On the 28th of March 1971, Charmaine was actually taken to the hospital because she had a pretty severe puncture wound on her left ankle, and it's not known exactly how she got this injury, but it is believed that it was inflicted by Rose, and she somehow explained it away to the doctors. I don't know what excuse she gave, but they clearly believed it. And then not long after this incident, 8-year-old Charmaine just suddenly vanished. Rose West murdered the 8-year-old. It's believed just shortly before Fred was released from prison in June of 1971. It was proven years later that Charmaine had been killed whilst Fred was in jail, so Rose had to be the one who killed her. But it's believed that Fred knew about the murder. Some people believe that the two of them planned it together beforehand because Charmaine was just too much of a handful. So Rose murdered her, and then when Fred eventually got out of prison, he buried her in the yard near the back door of the Midland Road flat. He removed her fingers and toes and also her wrists and ankles. And when people asked where Charmaine had gone, Fred and Rose just told them that the 8-year-old had gone to live with her real mother, Rena. Only they encountered a problem when Rena turned up one day in August of 1971, also asking where Charmaine had gone. And Fred panicked. He realised that he couldn't let Rena find out what really happened to her daughter, and so he hatched a plan to get rid of her as well. He told Rena that he would take her to see her daughter, but that they had to drive to where she was. They had to drive there. So Rena got into Fred's car and he began driving, and they actually stopped at a pub, and at the pub Fred made Rena just drink and drink and drink so much alcohol so that she was intoxicated, so that when he attacked her she would struggle to defend herself and put up a fight because she would be so drunk. Eventually they left the pub, they got back into Fred's car, and shortly after that Fred strangled his ex-partner Rena to death. He took her body back to his flat, 25 Midland Road, where he dismembered her, and then he put her remains into plastic bags. He put the bags into his car and buried Rena in a field called Letterbox Field, which was next to the field where he buried his first victim, Anna McFall. When Rena's remains were discovered years later, it was found that she had a metal pipe inserted into her throat, and a child's plastic boomerang was also found alongside her remains, and it's believed that these items were used to assault and torture Rena before she died. Months later, in January of 1972, Fred marries Rose, officially making her Rose West, and they actually got married in secret. From what I can gather, they didn't tell either of their families that they were getting married, and none of their friends or family attended the wedding. I don't know the reason behind that, why they chose not to tell anyone. Maybe it was because of Rose's father, because he really disapproved of Fred. But the newlyweds soon decided that they wanted to move out of their 25 Midland Road flat to a bigger house because they wanted more children and they wanted to raise their family in a bigger house, but they also wanted to have some more space for Rose to work. You see, she had actually been working as a sex worker for some time, and they wanted a separate area in their home for her and her clients. And eventually they found their perfect house, a house that would years and years later become infamous, number 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. It was a 3-story semi-detached house with a basement or a cellar, and Fred and Rose decided that to bring in some extra cash they would rent out some of the bedrooms on the upper floor to lodgers, and I believe that floor was also where Rose would take her clients. Fred would be the one to find Rose her clients. He was essentially her pimp, and he would he would just ask people straight up, do you want to sleep with my wife? And if they said yes, he would take them to her. He also took nude pictures of Rose and put them in magazines, hoping they would get more customers through this. As we know, Fred had a very sadistic sexual appetite. He loved violent sex. But it seems more than anything, he loved just watching Rose, watching his wife have sex with other men. That seemed to turn him on more than anything. Rose did her sex work in one particular room in the house, which they called Rose's room, and Fred had this room fitted with peepholes. He drilled a load of holes in the walls so that he could watch her having sex with these men. He also liked listening to his wife having sex, and he put baby monitors in Rose's room so that he could hear what was going on upstairs all throughout the house. Even if he was with his kids, he would just listen to his wife having sex from the baby monitor, meaning the children could hear it too. And when Rose's father, Bill Letts, found out what his daughter was doing, he began visiting Rose's room as well. He went there to have sex with his own daughter. He was actually one of her regular clients. In June of 1972, Rose gave birth to their second daughter, who they called Mae West. So now they had 3 children in the house: Anna Marie, Heather and Mae. And in September of 1972, Anna Marie, who was 8 years old, she was taken down to the cellar in the house. Now this cellar would become Fred and Rose's torture chamber, which I think Fred had soundproofed. Over the next several years, he would take many women down there and he would sexually assault them and kill them. And his first victim in this torture chamber was his 8-year-old daughter. He and Rose took Anna Marie down to this cellar, and I'm not going to go into details about what they did to her because it is horrific. But Rose basically held the 8-year-old down whilst Fred raped her, and I've actually got a quote from Anna Marie here about the ordeal, and she said, "I was told that I should be very grateful and that I was lucky I had such caring parents who thought of me. They were going to help me and make sure that when I got married I would be able to satisfy my husband and keep my husband. I was led to believe that all loving parents were the same." In November of 1972, Fred and Rose were driving through the town of Tewkesbury when they noticed a teenage girl on the side of the road, and she was thumbing for a lift. So they stopped beside her and learned that this girl was 17-year-old Caroline Roberts, although back then her last name was Owens. She was Caroline Owens. She was looking for a lift home. She lived in Cinderford, which was a bit beyond Gloucester, so Fred and Rose offered her a lift to Gloucester because obviously that's where they lived. And Caroline actually really liked Fred and Rose at first. They seemed like a really kind and friendly couple, and so she was delighted when they offered her a job as their nanny for the children. Caroline accepted the offer. She moved into their house and she shared a bedroom with Anna Marie, and it was very obvious to her that Anna Marie was terrified of her parents, but she didn't know why. At one point, Fred made a comment to Caroline saying that if she ever needed one, he was able to carry out abortions. He said that he had conducted many abortions before. He also started telling her about how 8-year-old Anna Marie was not a virgin. He said that she had already lost her virginity. And Caroline was, of course, really confused by this because Anna Marie was only 8 years old, and so she said, "What do you mean?" And Fred told her that she had lost her virginity when she got into an accident. He said that one day Anna Marie fell off her bicycle and that one of the bike handles entered her vagina and that she had to go to hospital because she was bleeding and in so much pain. But obviously this was just a lie to cover up what really happened, and he told Caroline this story in front of Anna Marie. Like I said before, Caroline really liked Fred and Rose at first, but after a while she just started feeling really uncomfortable around them, especially Fred, because he would make all these comments about abortions and Anna Marie, and all he would talk about was sex. On one occasion, the couple asked Caroline to join them in taking part in an orgy, and it was then when she decided that she did not want to work for them anymore or live with them, and so she moved out. However, Fred and Rose were not going to let her get away, and so about a month later, about a month after she moved out, they decided to try and find Caroline. By this point, they knew her routine pretty well. They knew what day and around what time she would be hitchhiking. It was something that she did often. She would walk to and from her boyfriend Tony's house. Anyway, one evening in December of 1972 at around 10:30 p.m, they spotted Caroline on the side of a road. She had just left her boyfriend's house, and Fred and Rose pulled up alongside her in their car. Straight away, Rose got out of the car and she started apologizing to Caroline. She said, "We are so sorry if we made you feel uncomfortable. We were only joking around. We didn't mean anything by it." And she offers Caroline a lift home as an apology, and Caroline accepts the lift. So Caroline gets into the back of the car, the back seat, and Rose gets in there with her, and she says that she just wants to have a girl chat with her. But as Fred begins driving, Rose starts touching Caroline. She's like caressing her face and touching her breasts, and Fred starts saying to her, "What do they feel like? What do her boobs feel like?" And then Rose starts trying to kiss Caroline, and Caroline feels really uncomfortable, so she pushes Rose off. But when she does, Fred turns around. At this point, he had parked the car. He turns around and just starts punching 17-year-old Caroline in the face repeatedly until she was unconscious. By the time she had woken up, she had been tied up and Fred had driven back home to Cromwell Street. They forced Caroline into the house and took her to one of the rooms downstairs. And for the next 12 hours, she was sexually assaulted and beaten in that room by both of them, by both Fred and Rose West. The next morning, Caroline heard a knock at the front door. The Wests had a visitor, and so Fred went to answer the door whilst Rose stayed in the room with Caroline. And Caroline saw an opportunity to try and get some help, so she tried to shout out, but as soon as she did, Rose jumped up and held a pillow over her face to silence her. The person who knocked at the door soon left, and Fred was absolutely furious with Caroline for trying to scream, and he said to her, quote, "I'll keep you in the cellar and let my black friends have you, and when we're finished with you, we'll kill you and bury you under the paving stones of Gloucester." Fred raped Caroline that morning, and then surprisingly afterwards, he was really apologetic. He started crying and saying that he is so sorry for what they did to her, which in my opinion he didn't actually mean. I don't think he was sorry at all. I think he just apologized because he wanted her to return as the children's nanny. After they did all of this to Caroline, they literally ask her if she'll come back and look after the children and be their nanny. And Caroline was so scared about what would happen if she said no. So she said, yeah, okay. Eventually, Caroline manages to escape the house and she goes back to her home, where her mother notices that she has bruises all over her body. And Caroline tells her what had happened, what Fred and Rose West had done to her. So the police were contacted and Fred and Rose were arrested and charged, and Caroline was due to give testimony, give evidence during their trial, but she just couldn't face it. She couldn't relive that horrific night, so she refused. And as a result, both Fred and Rose walked free. Their only punishment was a fine. They were both fined £50 each for an indecent assault charge. And that was that. Thankfully, Caroline managed to escape Fred and Rose West with her life, but a lot of girls didn't. And I'm about to talk through their murder spree now, but quickly before I do, I'm just going to run through the names of Fred and Rose's children, because over the following years, as they were committing these murders, Rose actually gave birth to several more children, the last of which was born in 1983. So first there was Charmaine and Anne-Marie, who were Fred and Rena's children, but as we know, Fred and Rose murdered Charmaine and Rena. After Anna-Marie, there was Heather, then May. After May came the couple's first boy, Stephen. Then there were two more girls, Tara and Louise, another boy, Barry, and then finally two more girls, Rosemary Jr. and Luciana. However, at least three of these children were not actually fathered by Fred. Some of them were fathered by Rose's clients, and I actually read on a couple of sources that some people believed Rose's own father, Bill, may have been the father of one of her children. As we know, he was a regular client of hers, but I don't know if that's ever been proven that he fathered one of her children. I can't be sure on that. I just read it on a couple of sources. The children that were not fathered by Fred had darker skin because Rose mostly slept with black men. Fred actually preferred her to sleep with black men, but Fred still pretended that he was their biological father, despite the fact that they had darker skin. And when the children would ask why they had slightly darker skin than their other siblings, Fred would tell them that it was because he had a great-grandmother who was black. As you probably guessed, all of the children were treated so badly by Fred and Rose. They were all really badly abused. But from what I can gather, Rose was actually worse than Fred. She would be violent towards her children more than Fred would. She would do the punishments, she would beat them constantly and shout at them. It seems as though they were probably more afraid of Rose than they were Fred. The children were taken to the hospital countless times over the years after being beaten because they had really bad injuries, and every single time Fred and Rose managed to explain these injuries away and just said that they were accidents, and none of them were reported to social services. So now on to the murder spree. So up until this point, there were 3 confirmed murders attributed to Fred and Rose West. There was obviously Anna McFall and Rena Costello, both previous partners of Fred's and both murdered by him as well. And also Rena's daughter Charmaine, who, as we know, was killed by Rose. Their first victim at 25 Cromwell Street was a 19-year-old girl named Linda Goff, and I believe Fred and Rose had been friends with Linda for a little while. According to a book I read, Linda had been seeing a couple of the lodgers that were staying in the West house on the 3rd floor, and she had also done some babysitting for Rose and West before as well. And when Caroline Owens stopped being the West nanny, the kids' nanny, Linda stepped in and took up the position instead. She moved into the house on the 19th of April 1973. But by the next day, she was already dead. Linda was sexually assaulted by Fred and Rose, just like Caroline Owens had been. But this time was different. They realised that they couldn't just let Linda go like they had let Caroline go, because Caroline went to the police and they couldn't risk Linda doing the same. So they decided that she had to die. I just think it's insane how Fred and Rose saw human life. To them, these women were just disposable items. If someone presented a problem to them, like Charmaine, who was too much of a handful for Rose, like Linda, who might go to the police, they had no issue with killing them to get rid of them. Linda Goff was murdered and then her body was dismembered by Fred. He cut off her fingers and toes so that she couldn't be identified through prints later on, and she was buried in a pit in their garage behind the house. And when her remains were found years later, it was found that she had tape around her mouth, which had clearly been put there to stop her from screaming during the torture. When the lodgers at 25 Cromwell Street asked what had happened to Linda and where she had gone, Fred and Rose told them that they had fired her as their nanny and kicked her out because she had hit Anna Marie. And they also told Linda's mother, June, that that's what happened too. Basically, about 2 weeks after Linda was last seen, her mother, June Goff, went to 25 Cromwell Street and asked Fred and Rose if they knew where her daughter had gone. And Rose just said to June, "No, sorry, I've got absolutely no idea where Linda is." But June noticed that Rose was actually wearing her daughter's slippers. After her murder, Rose had kept quite a few items of clothing that belonged to Linda because she liked them and she wanted to wear them herself. Anyway, June spotted that Rose was wearing her daughter's slippers and she pointed it out, and so Rose admitted that Linda had lived with them for a little while, but that she left to go and live in the seaside town of Weston-super-Mare in Somerset. And Linda's parents did think that this was really weird because she hadn't mentioned this to them, but anyway, they went to Weston-super-Mare to try and find their daughter, but of course they had no luck because she wasn't there. She was already dead. And for 21 years they had no idea what happened to Linda. It wasn't until years and years later, when her remains were found, that they finally learnt the horrible truth. Carol Ann Cooper was the next victim. She was a 15-year-old girl that lived in a children's home in Worcester. But on Saturday the 10th of November 1973, Carol went to the cinema with a couple of her friends and her boyfriend, who was called Andrew. After their cinema trip, they had some fish and chips and then they went to the pub, and then after this at around 9 p.m, Carol went to the nearby bus stop because she was going to go to her grandmother's house. But at some point that night, Carol encounters Fred and Rose West, and it's not known exactly how they managed to get Carol back to their home, whether she went with them willingly or whether they forced her into their car, we don't know. But anyway, they took the 15-year-old back to their house and down to the cellar, or the torture chamber. As soon as she entered the cellar, she was bound with cloth and gagged with surgical tape, and she was actually suspended from hooks on wooden beams in the ceiling while she was alive. And I believe this was something that Fred and Rose did with a lot of their victims. She was sexually assaulted, tortured, and eventually murdered. And her cause of death was believed to be from suffocation or strangulation. Just as a side note, as far as I'm aware, with a lot of the killings, it was difficult for authorities to determine exactly how each victim died because their remains were found years and years later when they were just skeletons. But it's believed that they probably, well, most of them died from asphyxiation. Carol's body was dismembered and decapitated in the cellar, and when her skull was eventually found, they noticed that she had a gouge mark in her head, which suggested that she had been stabbed either before or after death. If it was after death, then maybe this was something that happened during her decapitation. Anyway, she was buried in the cellar and she was actually reported as missing. However, she was never linked to Fred and Rose West at the time. No one had any idea what happened to her the night that she disappeared. The third victim at Cromwell Street was 21-year-old Lucy Partington. Lucy was in her final year at Exeter University. She was studying medieval English. However, in December of 1973, she was home with her family in Cheltenham for Christmas. On the evening of the 27th of December, Lucy was at a bus stop when she was picked up by Fred and Rose West. Again, the exact circumstances surrounding this are not known. We don't know if she was forced into their car or if she got in willingly. I also can't be sure if both Fred and Rose were in the car every single time they were searching for victims, or if just Fred would pick them up sometimes. From what I can gather, it was both of them most of the time, which does make sense because I feel like back then anyway, these girls would have been way more likely to get into a stranger's car if they saw a woman in there, if they saw Rose. If Fred, this older, dirty looking man, had pulled up alongside them on his own and offered them a lift, I think it's very unlikely that they would accept. But if Rose, this young, friendly looking woman, was also in the car, then perhaps they would be more trusting. Anyway, Lucy Partington was picked up and taken back to the cellar in the house where she was bound and gagged. She was assaulted and tortured, it's believed, for about a week. For 7 days she was kept alive in this cellar, and then she was eventually murdered and dismembered. And the reason they theorise she was kept in the cellar for a week was because in the early hours of the morning on the 3rd of January 1974, Fred actually went to the hospital because he had a pretty bad wound on his right hand that needed treating, and it's believed that he sustained this injury during the dismemberment of Lucy Partington's body. After her body was dismembered, Lucy's remains were also buried underneath the cellar, and the knife that was used to dismember her was actually found with her remains years later. They think that Fred probably accidentally cut himself with this knife and dropped it into the grave and just forgot to get it back out. In April of 1974, 21-year-old sociology student Therese Sinkgula was hitchhiking alone when she was picked up and taken back to Fred and Rose's home. She suffered the same fate as the previous victims. She was bound, gagged, raped and murdered, and afterwards Fred dismembered her and decapitated her and buried her under the cellar. Interestingly, one of the reasons why Fred decapitated his victims was because he was always worried that they weren't actually dead beforehand, so just to make sure he would cut off their heads. Later that same year, in November of 1974, Fred and Rose picked up 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard, who worked at a makeup counter in Debenhams. They picked Shirley up from a bus stop and took her back to their cellar, where they wrapped so much brown tape around her head to the point where it looked like she was wearing a mask. After she was killed, her body was cut up and she was buried underneath the cellar with the other victims. After Shirley, there was 18-year-old Juanita Mott. Now, she had actually been staying with the West on and off for a couple of years actually. She left home when she was just 15 and became one of the lodgers at Cromwell Street, so she knew Fred and Rose well. But from what I could tell, at the time of her death in 1975, she was staying with a friend of hers in a bungalow in Gloucestershire, but one evening in April, she was spotted by Fred and Rose on the side of a road, and they took her back to the House of Horrors. There she was tied up, abused, murdered and buried in the cellar. And I do just want to give a quick warning, because you can probably tell that I'm not going into too much detail about these murders, but the information about what these girls went through is available and public, and it is truly horrific. So much so that I do not even want to repeat some of the stuff that I have read about this case. So I just wanted to give a quick warning, because if you do decide to do some more research into this case yourself, just be wary that that information is out there and it is very upsetting and graphic. And I do just want to make it clear that Rose was very much an equal part in these sexual assaults and murders, though she would later deny it. But it wasn't just Fred. Rose wasn't a bystander in all of this. She would actively take part in these horrific crimes, particularly the sexual assaults. It was a level playing field for both of them. Surprisingly, during the time that all of this was going on, Fred was actually on police's radar, but not for murder. As I've mentioned a few times in this video, he was a thief. He would steal things constantly to sell on and make money, and I believe along with Rose's sex work, that was their main source of income. He would be in and out of court charged with theft, and he received many fines, and police officers would often go to 25 Cromwell Street to interview Fred about his stealing. They were questioning him about the fact that he was a thief, I really struggled to say that word, having no idea at the time that he was also a serial killer. But to be fair, he definitely wouldn't have come across as someone capable of these horrific crimes, because I've said it before, but Fred West was actually quite a charming guy. Pretty much everyone that knew him or had spoken to him before just said that he was a really friendly, funny man who seemed to get along with people really well. But in reality, he was a sadistic, evil person who, along with his evil wife, continued to look for more murder victims. In 1976, a teenage girl who was given the name Miss A by the courts to protect her identity was sexually assaulted by both Fred and Rose in their home. Miss A had been friendly with the West, particularly Rose, for a while. She had a bit of a troubled life. She had been sexually abused when she was a child by her father and brother, and as a result she spent a lot of her childhood and teenage years in children's homes. And at some point she meets Rose West, and she really liked Rose. Rose was very sympathetic to Miss A's situation, and Rose pretended that she was a friend. She pretended that she was a shoulder to cry on. And from researching this case, it's clear to me that this was something Rose did a lot. The way that she would reel in her victims was to make them think that they could trust her. She would act like she was this really kind and caring young woman, but then she would completely betray these girls and use them with Fred as her sex toys, essentially. Anyway, one day Miss A went to the West home, and Fred and Rose took her to a room in their house where two young girls were naked and tied up. They had been sexually assaulting and torturing these two girls, and Miss A was next. She was also assaulted by both Fred and Rose, and Miss A later said that she believed one of the young girls that was also being abused in that room was their daughter, Anna Marie, who would have been around 12 years old at this time. Honestly, the things they did to Anna Marie, their own child, well, Fred's own child, obviously Anna Marie was Rose's stepdaughter, but the things they did to her, some of the stuff that I've read, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. When she was a child, she was even forced to sleep with some of Rose's clients. Obviously, Rose was a sex worker, and Anna Marie was made to do the same. She was made to sleep with these men as her parents watched. The next murder victim was 18-year-old Shirley Robinson. Now, Shirley had also known Fred and Rose for a little while before she was killed. She would sometimes stay in the house as one of their lodgers, and she had been having an affair with Fred. I say affair because I don't think it was a secret from Rose. I mean, both Fred and Rose were married, but they would openly sleep with other people constantly. That was Rose's job. But I think that Shirley actually really liked Fred. It wasn't just sex for her. She was falling for him, and she soon discovered that she was pregnant with his child. And interestingly, at the same time that Shirley was pregnant, Rose was also pregnant, but not with Fred's child. This baby was Tara, and she was fathered by one of Rose's clients. And at first, Rose didn't seem to mind too much that Shirley was pregnant by her husband, but eventually she could not stand it. She became so jealous, whereas Fred could not care less that Rose was getting pregnant by other men. In fact, he quite liked it. Anyway, Shirley's baby was due to be born in June of 1978. However, she was murdered just a month before in May, and most people believe that Rose was the one to kill Shirley because she saw her as a threat to her relationship with Fred. Her body was dismembered, and Shirley was the first victim to be buried in the back garden at Cromwell Street because at this point the cellar was just too full with other bodies, and I believe Fred had covered the floor with a layer of concrete in the cellar. Fred continued to rape his daughter Anna Marie over the years, and he would threaten his other daughters with the same. He said that incest was completely normal, and he told them, quote, "I made you, you are my flesh and blood, I am entitled to touch you." And he said that it was his right and duty as a father to take his daughter's virginity. And their eldest son Stephen was also threatened with the same thing. He was told that when he was older, his mother Rose would be the one to take his virginity. And in the year 1979, Anna Marie found out that she was actually pregnant with her father's baby. However, she had an ectopic pregnancy and it was terminated at the Gloucestershire Royal Hospital. One source states that just a couple of days after the termination, Rose severely beat Anna Marie, and so she just decided that she had had enough and she ran away from home at 15 years old to go and live with some friends of hers. The next murder victim was a 16-year-old girl named Alison Chambers, who again was quite friendly with the West family, and she did some babysitting for them here and there. But in early August of 1979, Alison became the next girl that was sexually assaulted, tortured and murdered at 25 Cromwell Street, and she was dismembered before Fred buried her remains in the garden. So now that Anna Marie had gone, Heather was the oldest child in the West house, which meant that Fred now turned his attention to her. The three oldest children in the house at this point were Heather, May and Stephen, and they were beaten constantly by both parents and treated so badly. One night, Rose kicked all three of the children out of the house when it was snowing outside, and they were made to stay outside in the freezing cold for 3 hours before being let back in. But Heather, who was now the oldest child in the house, she seemed to get it worse than anyone. Her beatings were becoming more and more frequent, meaning she had more and more injuries and more bruises all over her body. And when she was at school, she used to get so nervous when getting changed for PE because she was so scared that her classmates would see all of the bruises she had on her body. Their school actually had a rule that everyone had to have a shower after the PE lesson, and Heather was often sent to the head teacher's office because she refused to have one, but no teacher ever seemed to realise why. Fred also began raping his daughter Heather, just like he had done with Anna Marie, and she would try to fight him off, and because she would do this, her parents were convinced that she had to be a lesbian because she didn't want to have sex with her father, so apparently she was gay. And they were furious at the thought that their daughter might be a lesbian, despite the fact that Rose would often sleep with and sexually assault other women. In the summer of 1986, when Heather was around 15, she was taking her CSE exams, and it was around this time that she finally told one of her friends, Denise, about what she was going through at home, and Denise told her parents. However, her parents were actually good friends with Fred and Rose, and they told Denise that Heather was lying because Fred and Rose would never do anything like that to their daughter. Heather left school at 16 years old, and straight away she started looking for a job away from Cromwell Street. She knew that she had to get out of that house and escape her parents. She was applying for so many jobs, but there was one in particular that she really wanted. In June of 1987, she applied for a job as a cleaner at a holiday camp in Devon, and she was desperate for this job because it meant that she could move away from her parents. So she was absolutely devastated when they phoned her and said that her application was unsuccessful. And when I say she was devastated, I mean devastated. She was so upset and depressed, and her siblings said that she would just cry for hours and hours and hours all through the night. It's heartbreaking because she was so desperate to get away from her abusive, horrible parents, and now she couldn't. The next morning after she received the rejection, it was the 19th of June 1987, and all of the West children went off to school apart from obviously Heather, because she didn't go to school anymore. She was just going to be spending another day at home with her parents, but by the time her siblings got home from school in the afternoon, Heather was gone. She was nowhere to be seen because Fred and Rose had actually murdered her that day. It's not known exactly what happened, why they decided Heather had to die that day. Some people theorise it was just an argument that got out of control. Some people think Heather probably threatened to go to the police about the fact that Fred was regularly raping her, and others think that the murder itself was sexually motivated. Maybe Fred tried to rape his daughter again that day and she just kept trying to fight him off, and so he got angry and strangled her to death. When her remains were later found, she was completely naked, so it does seem that there was a sexual element to the killing, but we don't know whether it was Fred or Rose that ended their daughter's life that day, but as usual it was Fred that dismembered the body and buried her remains in the garden. When the rest of the West children returned home from school that day, they obviously straight away noticed that Heather was not there, and when they asked where she was, her parents had to come up with a cover story. They told the children that Heather had actually been offered that cleaning job in Devon. The holiday camp had changed their mind and she had already left to start work. But the West siblings never saw or heard from Heather again. She never came to see them, nor did she contact them. And over the years, Fred began making little sick and twisted jokes about Heather's whereabouts. So obviously Fred and Rose told the children that Heather had just gone away and started a new job. But whenever the children misbehaved, Fred would threaten them and say, if you don't start behaving, you're going to end up buried under the patio in the garden, just like Heather. And this was something that he would threaten his children with constantly, to the point where it was like a family joke almost. He would say, if you don't start behaving, you will end up buried in the garden just like your sister. Fred and Rose told so many different stories to different people over the years about where Heather was. One minute they would say that she had gone to Devon for work, the next they would say that she had run away with a lesbian lover, but of course all of these were lies. Heather was dead. About 5 years after Heather's murder in 1992, Fred turned his attention to another one of his daughters, Louise, and he began raping her as well. He raped her a number of times, even filming it on one occasion, and Rose also witnessed one of these attacks. Afterwards, Louise would run to the bathroom because she would be bleeding and in so much pain, and her mother Rose would just turn to her and say, well, what did you expect? Now, information about this next part of the case differs slightly depending on which source you read, but from what I can gather, Louise eventually told one of her friends from school about the fact that her father had been raping her, and this friend informed the police. And so on the 6th of August 1992, police officers go to 25 Cromwell Street with a warrant to search for evidence of child abuse, and they found a lot of pornographic material, including countless sex toys, buckles and straps that had been used to beat people, and in total 99 pornographic videos, some of which were made by Fred and Rose. Fred and Rose were both arrested, Fred for the rape of a minor and Rose as an accomplice, although Rose was actually later released on bail whilst Fred was kept in custody. The younger children were all put into care, and a woman named Hazel Savage, who was a detective constable, led the West investigation. The West children were interviewed about their lives at home with their parents, although it seemed as though a lot of them were just too terrified to say anything. It was obvious that Fred and Rose had threatened them beforehand and told them to basically keep their mouths shut. Although one of the social workers had heard from a few of the children that they were repeatedly threatened by Fred and told that if they didn't behave, they would be buried under the patio just like their sister Heather. Detective Hazel Savage decided to go and speak to Anna Marie, who by this point would have been just under 30 years old, and she was married to a man named Chris Davis. Anyway, the detective went to speak to Anna Marie, and she pretty much told her everything, all of the abuse and torture she endured at the hands of her father Fred and stepmother Rose. She also told the detectives that she had been trying to contact and trace her real mother Rena and her older sister Charmaine for years, but that she couldn't. She had no idea where they were or what happened to them, and this immediately concerned the police. After speaking to Anna Marie, the detectives decided that they should try and find Heather West and get a statement from her about what her home life was like. They tried to track Heather through her national insurance number and Department of Social Security records, because if she had a job and paid tax, or if she had claimed benefits during the years that she was away, it would be on records, on file somewhere. But there was nothing, no trace of Heather West anywhere, suggesting either she had changed her identity, moved to another country, or she was dead. Whilst Fred was in custody, Rose really struggled on her own. Like I said earlier, she was released on bail. However, she was not allowed any contact with her younger children during the investigation, and at one point she actually tried to kill herself by taking a load of pills, but her son Stephen found her. Both Fred and Rose were due to go to trial in June of 1993. Fred was charged with 3 counts of rape, 1 count of buggery and cruelty to a child. And Rose was charged with encouraging and inciting him to have sex with a child and with cruelty. However, the case against them just completely collapsed when both Anna Marie and Louise decided that they couldn't bring themselves to testify against their parents. Even after all of the abuse they had suffered at the hands of their parents, they just couldn't do it. They couldn't testify against them, and this meant that the prosecution didn't really have any evidence. Their main witnesses against Fred and Rose had pulled out, so they didn't have a case, and so both Fred and Rose were acquitted of all charges, and they walked free and returned to 25 Cromwell Street. Although the authorities didn't let them have their younger children back, they remained in the care system, and the West were only allowed supervised visits to see them. So Fred and Rose at this point probably thought that they had gotten away with it with everything they had done, but Detective Constable Hazel Savage was not prepared to let their case go. She was convinced that the West had done something to their daughter Heather, and she was not going to give up. The police continued looking into Heather. They were trying desperately hard to locate her, but they couldn't find her anywhere. In early 1994, Hazel Savage asked her senior officers to obtain a search warrant for Fred and Rose's property. She strongly believed, from what the West children had said, that Heather was buried in the garden. Thankfully, the search warrant was granted on the 23rd of February 1994, and the next day, police officers went to 25 Cromwell Street. When they knocked on the front door, Rose answered it, and they showed her the warrant that they had to search the property, and immediately, Rose seemed to panic. She starts shouting at her oldest son, Stephen, and she's saying, get Fred now. Fred was actually at work at the time. He wasn't in the house, but he eventually arrived back home, by which time the officers had already begun their search for Heather West. Fred went to the police station and he was questioned about the disappearance of his daughter. And what's interesting is by this point, no one had accused him of anything, really. No one had accused him of killing Heather, but out of the blue and unprompted, Fred just said, quote, "I did not murder my daughter." The police hadn't even accused him of that yet, and out of the blue, he just went, "I did not murder my daughter." And Fred claimed that the police were just harassing him at this point. He said that they had some sort of grudge against him because he was acquitted for the rape of his other daughter. When Rose was questioned about Heather, she was just very aggressive. She would get so angry and she would shout and swear. She didn't at all seem like a mother who was concerned about her daughter, and she would constantly change her story. One minute Rose would say that she had no idea what happened to Heather. The next she would say Heather went off with a lesbian lover and that she had given her daughter £600 to start a new life somewhere else. And when the detectives would pick her up on this and point out that her story kept changing, she would get aggressive again. The police continued to search the house, but by the evening of that first search day, they hadn't found anything, nothing in the house or the garden, but the search was due to resume the next day. And Fred West soon realised that eventually they were going to find the bodies that he had buried because they were digging up the garden. It was only a matter of time before they found what they were looking for under the patio, and so he decided to make a confession. He spoke to his son Stephen that next morning and said, quote, "Son, I will be going away for a while. Look after Mum and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can and start a new life." He then went up to Detective Hazel Savage and asked to be taken to the police station, where he confessed to the murder of his daughter, Heather West. Fred said that he strangled Heather and buried her under the patio in the garden, and he offered to go back to Cromwell Street and show the police exactly where she was buried in the garden because he claimed that they were digging in the wrong place. Fred also claimed that his wife Rose had nothing to do with Heather's murder and that she had no idea that Heather was even dead. But of course the police didn't really believe him, and Rose was taken into custody for further questioning, since this was now looking like a murder inquiry. Meanwhile, the police continued searching the house, and on Saturday the 26th of February 1994, after a few days of searching, something was finally found. It was a human femur bone in a section of the garden that Fred didn't actually point out to the police. And then shortly after this discovery, they found even more human remains in a different area underneath the patio. Now, this area was the area that Fred said Heather was buried, if that makes sense. In this second area, in this second hole in the ground, there was a mass of human bones all jumbled together inside the remnants of a black bin bag. There were also clumps of human hair next to a skull. So all of these remains were taken to Professor Bernard Knight, who was a forensic pathologist, for further examination. And when he began looking at all of these bones and remains and piecing them together, he realized something. there were 3 femur bones. Now, the femur bone is the bone located in the human thigh, and there's only one of them in each thigh, so every person has 2 femur bones. But among these human remains, there were 3 femur bones. So Professor Knight said to the detectives, well, either this victim had 3 legs, or there's another body underneath the patio at Cromwell Street. The set of human remains that were found in the spot where Fred said Heather was buried made up almost a full skeleton. Some body parts were missing, such as the fingers and toes, but as we know, Fred cut them off, all of his victims, to prevent them from being identified through fingerprints. But like I said, it was almost a full skeleton, and soon dental records confirmed that this was the body of Heather West. But who did this 3rd femur bone belong to? Because it obviously wasn't Heather, she didn't have 3. So the police confronted Fred with this information that a 3rd femur bone had been found, indicating that there were remains of another victim in the garden. And this forced him into admitting that there were actually 2 more women buried in the garden. So the police obviously asked Fred who these women were, and Fred said that one of them was an ex-lover of his named Shirley Robinson, and he said that at the time of her murder, she was pregnant with his baby. And he said that the other woman, the other victim, was, quote, Shirley's mate. He said that he couldn't remember what her name was. Just as a side note, it wasn't Shirley's mate. Shirley and this other victim didn't know each other. So Fred was once again taken back to Cromwell Street to point out the graves of these 2 other women. And when he got there, he actually got pretty angry with the police and the mess they had made in his garden. And he said that he expected them to put everything back when they were finished. Anyway, he pointed out these graves, and eventually the 2 other sets of human remains were discovered, and Fred West was charged with 3 murders. The murder of his daughter Heather West, the murder of Shirley Robinson, and the murder of this other woman. At the time they didn't know who she was, but I believe she was later identified as being Alison Chambers. Meanwhile, the police had decided to begin searching the rest of the house and not just the garden, and they were also questioning Fred about his ex-wife Rena Costello and Rena's daughter Charmaine, who both had not been seen for about 20 years at this point. They were convinced that Fred must have done something to Rena and Charmaine as well. And Fred realised by this point that his time was up. Up until now, he had admitted to 3 murders, but he knew that it was only a matter of time before the bodies of the rest of his victims would be found. And so he made another confession. Fred asked his solicitor to pass along a note he had written to Superintendent John Bennett, the head of the West investigation. And this note read, quote, I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further approximately 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena and others to be identified. Fred claimed that there were 6 more bodies buried at Cromwell Street, 5 of which were buried in the cellar, and the 6th under what was now the bathroom floor, but was previously the garage. But he said that he couldn't really remember the names of the victims. He said that he would just pick most of them up from the side of the road and soon after he would kill them. So he didn't really know them very well. The only one he said he could remember out of these 6 was Linda Goff. So after this confession, the search teams continued searching the house, and between the 5th and the 8th of March 1994, all 6 bodies were recovered, one of which, as I said, was Linda Goff, and the rest would later be identified as Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Teresa Zinkgula, Shirley Hubbard and Juanita Mott, although it did take a while for them to be identified. It was really difficult for detectives to identify these women because by the time their remains were found, they were so badly decomposed, and like I said, Fred couldn't remember their names, or if he could, he wasn't telling the detectives. Fred also admitted to the murders of his ex-wife Rena and stepdaughter Charmaine, although as we know already, he did not kill Charmaine. That was definitely Rose. He was in prison when Charmaine was killed, so he was just covering for her. He also admitted to knowing where the body of Anne McFall was buried, but he insisted that he did not kill her. I don't know why he denied the murder of Anne McFall. One source I read said that he said that his ex-wife Rena killed Anne, but authorities don't believe that. They believe that Fred killed her. Anyway, he took detectives to the different areas where Charmaine, Rena and Anne were buried, and between April and June of 1994, all of their remains were found. Fred was insistent that his wife Rose knew absolutely nothing about the murders. He said that she was completely innocent, and that the reason he killed all of these women was because he had slept with them, and then afterwards they threatened him and said that they would tell Rose about his infidelity, and he couldn't risk them doing that, so he murdered them to shut them up. But the detectives did not believe that for a second. They did not believe that Rose West knew nothing about the killings, and they did not believe that she was not involved in any way. And by the end of April of 1994, Rose West had been arrested and charged with the assault of an 8-year-old boy and with the rape of an 11-year-old girl. Both of these crimes occurred in the 1970s, and a 67-year-old man was also charged with the rape of this 11-year-old girl. There isn't much information online about this, so I can't be 100% sure what happened here, but from what I can gather, this 67-year-old man was one of Rose's clients, and together they raped this 11-year-old girl sometime in the 70s. The police had enough evidence to charge her for this crime and keep her in jail, and in the meantime they were looking for evidence to show that she was involved in the murders. Rose was questioned by detectives about the murder of her daughter Heather and the murder of Linda Goff, because if you remember, Linda's mother went looking for her daughter after she disappeared, and she noticed that Rose was wearing her daughter's slippers, and some of Linda's clothing was on her washing line, which doesn't indicate that Rose knew nothing of Linda's murder, you know? It was just so suspicious, and the detectives asked Rose why she had Linda's clothing, and she couldn't explain it. And so just the next day, she was charged with the murder of Linda Goff. Rose never admitted to anything. All she would ever say was, "I'm innocent, I'm innocent." But as the investigation continued, the detectives had more and more women coming forward to say that they had been sexually assaulted by both Fred and Rose West at Cromwell Street. Not just Fred, but Rose as well. They said that she was an active participant in the sexual assaults and rapes. On the 30th of June 1994, both Fred and Rose West were taken to Gloucester Magistrates Court for their charges, and this was the first time they had actually seen each other since February. They were taken to court and they were both jointly charged with 9 murders, and Fred was charged with another 2. So in total he was charged with 11 murders and Rose was charged with 9. And Rose was very cold towards her husband at court. They had to stand next to each other, and at one point Fred put his hand on Rose's shoulder and she just instantly shrugged him off and didn't say a word to him or even look at him. She didn't want anything to do with him because she was pretending that she was completely innocent and that he carried out all of these horrific crimes on his own. In December of that same year, they were brought before the court again because Fred was charged with another murder, making his total now 12. And once again, at this court appearance, Rose was so cold with him. She wouldn't even look at Fred, and I genuinely think this really hurt him. He was a cold-blooded serial killer, a monster that did horrific things, some of the worst things I have ever read. But he was genuinely wounded and heartbroken by the fact that his wife was ignoring him and the fact that she didn't want him anymore. I think in Fred's eyes, they were like this unbreakable couple who, despite everything, would always love each other and would always be there for one another. But in Rose's case, he was just her scapegoat. She saw him as the only way she could possibly get away with this, by pinning all of the blame on him. And Fred was so depressed as a result of his wife's rejection. Apparently he would often be heard weeping in his cell, and he was categorized as a vulnerable prisoner. He was on suicide watch because they thought that he might try and end his life. But eventually this was eased and they didn't think he was a risk anymore, but they were wrong. And on the 1st of January 1995, so New Year's Day, 53-year-old Fred West hung himself in his prison cell using his bedsheet. When he was eventually found in his cell, attempts were made to revive him, but they didn't work, and Fred West was pronounced dead. Rose was soon told of her husband's passing, and apparently she didn't really show any emotion whatsoever. She didn't cry or anything like that. Fred actually left a suicide note in his cell, which was essentially just kind of like a love letter to Rose. I've got a couple of quotes from it here. He said, quote, "The most wonderful thing in my life was when I met you. Our love is special to us. So love, keep your promises to me. You know what they are. Where we are put together forever and ever is up to you. We loved Heather, both of us. I would love Charmaine to be with Heather and Rena. You will always be Mrs. West all over the world. That is important to me and to you." At the end of the note, Fred drew a picture of a gravestone, and this gravestone read, quote, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West. Rest in peace when no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." So now that Fred was dead, Rose was the only one due to go to trial for these homicides. And after his death, yet another murder charge was added. She was also charged with the murder of her stepdaughter, Charmaine. So 41-year-old Rose West was now being charged with 10 murders, and she pled not guilty to every single one. She was not charged with the murder of Rena Costello or Anna McFall. It's believed that Fred committed those on his own, but the prosecution believed that she was involved in all of the other murders. So all of the murders committed at 25 Cromwell Street and the murder of Charmaine West, which happened whilst they were living at Midland Road. On top of the murder charges, she was also charged with 2 counts of rape and the indecent assault of 2 young girls in the 70s. However, I believe the rape and assault charges were later dropped and put aside for a possible separate trial later, so she was just going to trial for the murder charges. Her trial began in early October of 1995, and as I said, Rose pleaded not guilty to all of the charges. She was still denying any involvement or knowledge about the murders. Rose's defense team claimed that all of the evidence they had against her was circumstantial. They said they had no solid evidence that Rose took part in these horrific crimes. However, the prosecution had several witnesses take the stand, including Caroline Owens, and she described the sexual assault and torture she was subjected to by both Fred and Rose in 1972. And she talked about how she even tried to kill herself after the ordeal because she was just so traumatized by it. I feel so bad for Caroline because she held so much guilt about this whole thing. She felt like if she had just given evidence against Fred and Rose in the 70s when they did what they did to her, then maybe they would have gotten an actual prison sentence then, and they wouldn't have been able to go on and do what they did to these other girls. So she was really brave, and she made sure that she gave evidence against Rose in this trial. She was not going to let her get away with these crimes. The woman known as Miss A, who I talked about earlier on, she also gave evidence in court on the 16th of October, and she described the time when she was abused and raped by Fred and Rose. And Anna Marie also took the stand in court, and she talked about the years and years of sexual abuse that she suffered at the hands of her father and stepmother, including the first time they ever raped her when she was 8 years old. Anna Marie also described how Rose would beat her constantly with just about anything. Her fists, she beat her with about a saucepan. Rose would be violent and beat all her children, but she was very clever with it. She would make sure that she didn't beat or injure their faces so that their faces didn't have any bruises. If she injured anywhere else on their bodies, she could cover it up with clothes, but she couldn't do that with their faces, so she just would avoid their face. As you can imagine, it was so traumatizing for Anna Marie to give evidence during the trial. Apparently she broke down in tears a lot, and a couple of days after giving evidence, she actually tried to end her life, but she was taken to hospital and she survived. Another witness that gave evidence during Rose's trial was a 39-year-old woman named Janet Leach. Now, Janet was Fred's appropriate adult. She was basically assigned to be Fred's friend and confidant when he was arrested in 1994, and he would speak to her often about the case. And Janet told the court how Fred told her that he and Rose had made a pact together before his arrest. This pact was that he would take full responsibility for absolutely everything, even the murders that he described as being, quote, some of Rose's mistakes. Janet claimed that Fred expressed to her that Rose did in fact play a major part in these killings, particularly the murder of Shirley Robinson. Apparently Rose committed that murder and Charmaine's murder on her own, and that she was the one to remove Shirley's unborn child from her womb. If you remember, Shirley was pregnant with Fred's baby, and Rose was not happy about it. Janet Leach actually collapsed in court one day as she was giving her testimony. I think she may have had a stroke, but she just found the whole experience really stressful, and she collapsed and was taken to hospital. But she did eventually return to court in a wheelchair to finish giving evidence and for her cross-examination. The trial came to an end on the 22nd of November 1995, and the jury unanimously decided that 41-year-old Rose West was guilty of all of the 10 murders she was charged with. Her sentence was life imprisonment, with the judge, Mr. Justice Mantle, turning to her and saying, quote, Rosemary Pauline West, on each of the 10 counts of murder of which you have been unanimously convicted by the jury, the sentence is one of life imprisonment. If attention is paid to what I think, you will never be released. Take her down. Rose pretty much immediately filed an appeal for her convictions, still insisting that she was completely innocent and that Fred was the only serial killer, not her. But this appeal was rejected, and in 1997 she was actually given a whole life tariff, meaning that she will remain in prison till the day she dies without a doubt. Rose West is the second of 3 women to be given a whole life tariff in Britain. The first was Myra Hindley and the third was Joanne Dennehy. I've actually done a video about Joanne Dennehy, so if you want to see that, I'll link it in the description box for you. I've never done a video about Myra Hindley, so let me know if you would like me to, and I will add it to the list. Number 25 Cromwell Street, which has also become known as the House of Horrors, was demolished in 1996 and is actually just a public pathway now. In 2001, Rose announced that she was not going to appeal her convictions anymore. She still maintained her innocence, but I think she just realised there was no point in appealing. There was no way she was ever going to be released. Rose West is a Category A prisoner, and according to reports, she moved to prison in 2019. She was moved to HM Prison Newhall, which is in West Yorkshire in England, and she is currently 66 years old. You may be wondering what happened to the West children after this whole thing. The youngest West children all grew up in care homes away from Gloucester, and they were given new names. Stephen West, who was Fred and Rose's eldest son, he has a child himself now, but in 2004, when he was in his early 30s, he was actually sentenced to 9 months in prison for getting a 14-year-old girl pregnant. A lot of the West children now have kids of their own, including Anna Marie and May. And speaking of Mae West, I actually read her book about this case. Let me just grab it a second to show you. This is the book. It's called Love As Always, Mum, The True and Terrible Story of Surviving a Childhood with Fred and Rose West. I read this book around the start of this year. I think someone on Instagram messaged me and suggested that I read it, and it's actually a really interesting read. May just talks about her life growing up in the West household, and there's actually some letters in it that her mother Rose wrote her while she was in prison. It's a really interesting read, like I said, so if anyone else wants to read it, I will leave a link in the description. I think I got my copy from Amazon. But yeah, that is everything I have for you on the case of Fred and Rose West. I just know that this video is going to be probably my longest one yet. My voice is gone after recording this video. I don't know if you can tell, but my voice has gone so croaky because I've been filming for hours and hours. I hope I did the case justice. I tried to include as much information as possible, but this case is so huge. Probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I've ever covered on my channel. As usual, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear if you think Fred and Rose would have done what they did had they never met each other. Like, would they have both been killers if they had never met each other? I think that Fred would have. I mean, he did kill before he met Rose. He killed Anna McFall, so I think he would have gone on to murder others as well anyway, even if he had never met Rose. But I don't know if Rose would have done the same. Would she have gone on to murder if she had never met Fred West? Before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.